In the popular imagination, the medieval world opens with a familiar image: a great stone hall, a fire crackling softly at one end, a round table polished smooth by years of elbows and cups. Around it sit noble knights in shining armour, each equal, each honourable, each impossibly clean for the Middle Ages. It is a comforting picture. It is also almost entirely fictional. And yet, like most enduring myths, it did not appear from nothing. The story of the Knights of the Round Table feels ancient, as though it must have been whispered in torchlit halls long before it was ever written down. But the version we recognise today was assembled gradually, piece by poets, clerics and court storytellers who were often describing the world they wanted, rather than the one they lived in. To understand where the Round Table came from, we have to step away from Camelot for a moment, and into a much rougher Britain. The earliest hints of King Arthur appear not in grand romances, but in sparse medieval chronicles, lists of battles, fragments of memory, and half-remembered names. Arthur, if he existed at all, was likely not a crowned king ruling a united realm. He may have been a Roman-British war leader, living sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century after Roman authority collapsed in Britain. This was not a golden age. This was a time of abandoned roads, crumbling forts, and small kingdoms constantly fighting one another. The landscape was dotted with hill forts and timber halls, not marble palaces. Armour, if worn at all, was practical and mismatched, and no one, absolutely no one, was sitting at a perfectly symmetrical table discussing honour. Arthur's role, according to early sources, was simple. He fought, and he won. Later writers would inflate this into legend, but at its core, Arthur was remembered as a defender, a figure who resisted invading Saxon forces and briefly held order together in a fractured land. If that sounds less romantic than the stories you've heard, that's because the romance came later. The famous Round Table does not appear in the earliest Arthurian mentions at all. There are no equal seats, no polished oak, no symbolism. The Round Table first emerges centuries later, in the 12th century, when medieval Europe was obsessed with hierarchy, who outranked whom, who sat closest to the lord who had earned honour rather than inherited it, and that obsession created a problem. If Arthur was the greatest king and his knights were the greatest warriors, how could they all sit together without constant arguments about status? The Round Table was the solution. By making the table round, no knight sat at the head. No seat was visibly superior. Everyone was theoretically equal, a radical idea in a society where inequality was the organising principle of daily life. It was, in a way, medieval wish fulfillment, a fantasy not of dragons and magic, but of fairness. And like most fantasies, it ignored reality completely. The knights of Arthurian legend, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Galahad, were not drawn from historical rosters. They were literary inventions shaped to embody specific virtues. One was brave, another loyal, another pure to an almost inconvenient degree. Together they formed a moral instruction manual disguised as adventure. But real medieval knights were very different. They were landholders and soldiers, bound by contracts, debts, and feudal obligation. They fought for pay, land, or survival. Many never owned armour as a matched set. Some never learned to read. And their idea of equality generally stopped the moment someone tried to take their seat at dinner. The Round Table knights were not meant to be realistic, they were meant to be aspirational. They represented what medieval elites wanted to believe about themselves, that power could be noble, violence could be restrained, and hierarchy could be softened by virtue. It is telling that these stories became popular at the same time real knights were becoming increasingly criticised for brutality and corruption. When reality disappointed, legend stepped in. Camelot itself is another clue that we are dealing with myth rather than memory. No archaeological site can be confidently identified as Camelot. Over the centuries, dozens of locations have claimed the title, from hill forts to ruined castles, but none fit the literary descriptions very well. That may be because Camelot was never meant to be found. Camelot is described as prosperous but fragile, magnificent yet doomed. It exists just long enough to show what could have been, before collapsing under betrayal, jealousy, and human weakness. In other words, Camelot functions less like a city and more like a warning. Even the perfect kingdom cannot survive flawed people. A subtle message, perhaps, but medieval audiences were very good at reading between the lines. So if the Knights of the Round Table were fictional, why do they still matter? Because they solved a problem medieval society couldn't. They imagined a world where strength served justice, where leaders were chosen by merit, and where power came with moral responsibility. These were not everyday experiences in the Middle Ages, they were hopes. The Round Table was never about the past, it was about longing, and that longing proved contagious. The story crossed borders, languages and centuries as it absorbed Christian symbolism, courtly love, and later, even national identity. By the time armour gleamed and banners flew in illustrated manuscripts, the original rough Britain had vanished entirely. What remained was a dream polished smooth by repetition, a dream people still recognise today. When the stories of Arthur and his knights grew more elaborate, they began to describe a very specific kind of life, one built around honour, loyalty, and constant readiness for noble action. But the daily reality of knighthood, even in its most idealised form, was far less poetic. A knight's life was not spent wandering endlessly from adventure to adventure. Most days were repetitive, physically demanding and quietly uncomfortable. Long before tournaments or quests, a knight's world revolved around land, obligations and preparation, much of it dull, some of it exhausting. Morning often began before sunrise, not with trumpet calls or dramatic summons, but with the sounds of a household coming to life. Servants moved through draughty halls, horses stamped in their stalls, fires had to be rebuilt from embers that barely survived the night. Armour did not wait neatly on a stand. It had to be carried, adjusted, strapped and often repaired. Chainmail was heavy, awkward and unforgiving. It pinched skin, pulled at shoulders and grew painfully hot once the day warmed. Even well-made armour rarely fit perfectly, and most knights owned pieces acquired over years, replaced, borrowed or reforged after damage. The image of a knight effortlessly donning gleaming armour ignores the simple truth. It usually took assistance, patience and more than a little irritation. Weapons required constant attention, swords dulled quickly, leather cracked, wooden shields warped with moisture. A knight who neglected his equipment did not last long. And so much of daily life involved maintenance rather than heroics. Training filled the long gaps between conflict. Practice was repetitive by design. Mounting and dismounting horses, drilling with shields, striking posts or practice dummies until muscle memory took over. There was nothing romantic about it. The goal was not elegance but survival. And yet, even in training, hierarchy ruled everything. Knights were rarely equals. Titles, land ownership, and favour with the lord determined status far more than bravery. Younger or lesser knights deferred constantly, waiting to speak, waiting to sit, waiting to be noticed. This is where the idea of the Round Table quietly reveals its fantasy. In real halls, seating mattered deeply. Who sat closest to the Lord was not symbolic, it was political. Meals were social maps of power. A misplaced chair could cause resentment that lasted years. The Round Table erased this tension in story form, smoothing over a reality that was anything but smooth. Meals themselves were functional, not refined. Bread, stews, salted meat and ale made up most fare. Plates were often shared. Utensils were basic. Conversations, when they happened, were practical, about land, disputes, marriages or obligations still unpaid. Knights were not philosophical idealists debating virtue over wine. They were administrators of force bound by oaths that were often complicated and occasionally inconvenient. Honour, so central to Arthurian legend, was not a universal code. It was flexible, situational, sometimes ignored entirely when survival or advantage demanded it. Loyalty too was conditional. A knight served a lord as long as protection, payment or land continued to flow. If those failed, allegiance could shift, quietly at first, then openly. Betrayal was not shocking in the medieval world. It was expected. This makes the later legends all the more revealing. Stories of unwavering loyalty, perfect fellowship, and knights who never questioned their king did not describe how knights behave. They described how medieval society wished they would behave. The Round Table offered an imagined alternative to daily friction, a place where disputes dissolved, where rank did not dominate conversation, where strength served something higher than ambition. Not because such a place existed, but because people wanted it to. As these stories spread, they began to reshape how knighthood itself was understood. Younger nobles learned what a knight ought to be, not from real examples, but from stories polished smooth by repetition. And slowly the myth began influencing reality, at least in aspiration. But aspiration is easier than practice, because even the most ideal knight still had to live in a world of mud, debt, fatigue and human weakness. And those weaknesses, once introduced into legend, would eventually pull the entire story apart. As the legends of Arthur spread, they did something unexpected. They did not merely describe knighthood, they began to reshape how it was performed. By the High Middle Ages, knighthood had become as much a public display as a military role. What mattered was not only what a knight did in battle, but how he appeared doing it, and who was watching. This was the world of tournaments, pageantry, and carefully staged honour. Tournaments were not spontaneous tests of bravery. They were planned events, announced in advance, attended by nobles, merchants, clergy and spectators who travelled long distances to watch. Temporary towns formed around them. Stalls sold food, drink and trinkets. Minstrels performed. Chroniclers took notes. For many knights, tournaments were safer and more profitable than real warfare. Combat was structured, regulated and bounded by rules that shifted constantly. Some tournaments resembled mass cavalry clashes, others were individual jousts. Injuries were common, deaths were not unheard of, but the goal was rarely to kill, it was to impress. A knight's reputation was built here, in front of an audience. Armour became brighter, more personalised. Shields bore symbols meant to be recognised at a distance. Horses were trained not just for combat, but for presentation. Controlled movement, steady posture, visible strength. Everything was performance. The Arthurian legends fed directly into this culture. Knights modelled themselves after Lancelot or Gawain, not because those figures were real, but because they were recognisable. The stories provided a script. Courage looked a certain way, courtesy sounded a certain way. Honour followed a predictable arc. Even failure could be reframed, if it fit the story well enough. Courtly love emerged from this same impulse. In the legends, knights devoted themselves to unattainable women, queens, noble ladies, figures placed deliberately out of reach. Love was expressed through service, restraint, and longing rather than fulfillment. This was not accidental. Marriage among the nobility was transactional, arranged for land, alliances, or inheritance. Courtly love offered something different, an emotional theatre where desire could be expressed safely so long as it remained mostly symbolic. A knight might wear a lady's colours, dedicate victories to her, or compose verses in her honour. Whether the affection was returned mattered less than how convincingly it was displayed. Again, appearance mattered more than truth. The Round Table fit perfectly into this world. It offered a vision of knighthood as harmonious, refined and morally coherent, a sharp contrast to the political manoeuvring, private feuds, and quiet resentments that defined real courts. In stories, knights argued only when it revealed a lesson. In life, they argued constantly, usually over land. The legends smoothed these edges. They suggested that knighthood could be elevated above ordinary ambition, that violence could be disciplined into virtue, that men trained for war could also be guardians of moral order. It was an attractive idea, especially to those who benefited from it. Kings and lords encouraged these ideals because they made knights easier to manage. A knight who believed in honour and restraint was less likely to rebel openly. A knight who valued reputation might think twice before breaking an oath too publicly. Myth became a tool. But the stories themselves knew this balance was fragile. As the Arthurian cycle expanded, it grew darker. Betrayals multiplied. Quests failed. Knights who once embodied virtue began to fracture under jealousy, pride, or desire. This was not a contradiction, it was an admission. Perfect knighthood could not survive contact with real human behaviour. The very ideals that elevated knights also created impossible expectations. When knights failed, as they inevitably did, the fall felt catastrophic. This tension is why the Arthurian world always collapses. Camelot does not fade gently, it implodes. Friendships break, trust erodes, loyalty splinters. Even the Round Table itself becomes a symbol of what was lost rather than what endures. And this too resonated with medieval audiences. They lived in a world where kingdoms rose and fell quickly, where alliances shifted without warning, where yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's traitor. The legends mirrored their anxieties, not just their hopes. The brilliance of the Arthurian myth lies here. It does not pretend perfection is sustainable. It allows it briefly, perhaps just long enough to be admired, before reminding the listener that human weakness always returns. By the late Middle Ages, these stories had become deeply embedded in noble education. Young men learned how to behave not only from fathers and tutors, but from imagined knights who never truly existed. They learned what to aspire to. They also learned what to fear. Because in the end, Arthur's world does not fall to invaders. It falls from within. That lesson lingered. Even as armour evolved, firearms replaced swords and knighthood lost its military relevance, the image of the knight remained powerful. It transformed into something symbolic, an ideal of conduct rather than a profession. Honour, service, restraint. Concepts that had once justified violence were repurposed to limit it. The Round Table survived not because it was real, but because it was useful. It offered a language for talking about power without celebrating cruelty. A way to imagine authority bound by rules, even when those rules were frequently broken. And so the stories endured, not as history, not as truth, but as a mirror, reflecting what people hoped a strength could become, even when it rarely did. By the time the legends reached their final forms, no one truly believed Camelot had existed exactly as described. But that was never the point. The point was that for a moment it felt possible, and sometimes that is enough. As the medieval world receded, the stories that had once given it shape did not vanish with it. They lingered, not as records of the past, but as frameworks through which later societies tried to make sense of power, order, and responsibility. When armour fell out of use and swords lost their place on the battlefield, the knight did not disappear. He changed function. What had once been a social role slowly became an idea, stripped of practical obligation but heavy with meaning. In the centuries that followed the Middle Ages, Europe entered periods of rapid transformation. Political authority centralized, warfare professionalized, social hierarchies hardened into law rather than custom. The world that had produced Arthurian legend no longer existed in any recognizable form. Yet the legend survived precisely because it was no longer tied to reality. Without the burden of accuracy, it could be adapted. In the medieval imagination, the story of Arthur had been mythic, a way of explaining chaos, invasion, and fragile order through heroic narrative. Kings rose and fell quickly. Violence was intimate and personal. The legend gave shape to fear and hope alike, offering a vision of unity that reality rarely provided. By the time those conditions disappeared, the story was ready to be repurposed. During the Victorian era, Arthurian legend returned with renewed intensity, but with a different emphasis. The knights were no longer models of military behaviour, they became models of character. This shift was not subtle. Industrialisation altered daily life in ways that felt disorienting. Work became repetitive and impersonal. Cities expanded beyond comprehension. Traditional bonds of land and lineage weakened, replaced by contracts, schedules, and institutions. In this environment, the Middle Ages appeared distant, slower, and emotionally coherent. Whether or not that image was true, Victorian writers and artists reshaped Arthurian legend into a moral landscape. Violence was softened, physical hardship faded into the background. What remained was an emphasis on restraint, duty, and inner struggle. Knights were praised not for conquest but for self-control. Arthur became less a war leader and more a moral centre. Camelot transformed into an ethical ideal, a place where power was guided by conscience rather than force. This was not historical recovery, it was cultural need. The Victorian version of Camelot answered a question its society was asking: how should authority behave in a modern world? The answer was framed through medieval imagery, but the concerns were contemporary. Power, the stories suggested, must justify itself morally. Strength must be tempered by responsibility. Leadership must appear virtuous, not merely effective. That version of the legend proved influential. It shaped education, literature, and national identity. Knighthood became shorthand for decency, fairness, and restraint, even when detached entirely from its original context. But as the modern era progressed, certainty eroded again. The 20th century introduced wars fought on scales previously unimaginable. Violence became mechanized and distant. Individual heroism felt increasingly irrelevant in the face of systems that operated beyond personal control. In this environment, the old moral clarity of Camelot began to feel insufficient. The knight still appeared in stories, but no longer as an unquestioned ideal, became conflicted. Doubt replaced certainty. Loyalty competed with conscience. Authority was no longer assumed to be legitimate simply because it claimed virtue. Modern retellings of Arthurian themes reflect this unease. Leaders fail, systems collapse under their own contradictions. Attempts at perfect order reveal hidden costs. Unity fractures not only because of betrayal, but because ideals themselves conflict. This is not a rejection of the legend, it is an evolution. The modern world does not ask the story to explain how to rule or how to behave. It asks something quieter and more difficult: whether ideals can survive contact with reality at all. Camelot, in this context, becomes less a destination and more a question. What happens when power tries to be just? What fails first, the system or the people within it? And is imperfection a flaw or an inevitability? The endurance of the Arthurian legend lies in its willingness to leave these questions unresolved. It does not insist that justice always prevails. It does not promise that unity can be sustained indefinitely. It allows ideals to exist briefly, then shows how fragile they are. That fragility is the point. In every era, the story reflects the concerns of those telling it. Medieval audiences saw mythic defense against chaos. Victorian audiences saw moral order in a changing world. Modern audiences see uncertainty, a tension between aspiration and disillusionment. Yet the legend persists because it continues to offer a language for discussing power without celebrating cruelty, and leadership without denying failure. The Round Table no longer represents equality achieved. It represents equality attempted. Camelot no longer represents perfection. It represents effort and the cost of maintaining it. This is why the story has never settled into a final form. Each generation reshapes it, not to preserve the past, but to interrogate the present. The legend survives not because it answers questions, but because it refuses to stop asking them. And perhaps that is its quiet strength. It does not tell us what the world was, it tells us what people hoped it could be, and why that hope is always complicated. In early medieval Britain, during the 6th and 7th centuries, stories did not live on pages. They lived in voices. Most people could not read. Writing materials were rare. What endured were spoken narratives, carried by travelling storytellers, poets, and singers who moved between villages, halls, and early royal courts. These stories were flexible by necessity. Memory shaped them as much as intention. In this earliest period, the Arthurian material was not a single tale. It was a loose collection of names, battles, and heroic impressions tied to a time when Roman authority had collapsed and small kingdoms struggled for survival. Stories from this era were short, practical, and focused on defence rather than romance. Arthur, when mentioned at all, appeared as a war leader, not a king of legend. As Britain moved into the early Middle Ages, roughly the 8th to 10th centuries, these oral traditions continued to circulate, but they changed as political conditions stabilised. Christian monasteries became centres of learning and record-keeping. Monks began writing down fragments of earlier traditions, often blending them with moral or spiritual interpretation. This was not preservation in the modern sense. It was interpretation. Early medieval chroniclers were not concerned with consistency. They recorded what served their understanding of history, faith, and order. Arthur might appear briefly or not at all, depending on the author's priorities. Contradictions were tolerated, gaps were ignored. The legend remained incomplete and adaptable. By the 12th century, during the High Middle Ages, the Arthurian world transformed dramatically. This period saw the rise of courtly culture across Western Europe, especially in Norman England and Capetian France. Literacy expanded among elites. Courts became centres of art, poetry, and performance. Stories were no longer meant only to entertain, they were meant to instruct. It was during this century that the familiar elements of Arthurian legend took shape. The Round Table emerged, named knights multiplied, romance, loyalty and moral testing moved to the centre of the narrative. Poets writing in Old French and Middle English reworked earlier material into long narrative cycles designed for aristocratic audiences. These stories reflected 12th century concerns, not 6th century realities. Hierarchy, honour, inheritance, and courtly behaviour mattered deeply in this era, and the legend reshaped itself to address those values. Importantly, these writers were not collaborating. Each court produced its own version. As a result, the legend fragmented rather than unified. During the 13th and 14th centuries, still within the High to Late Middle Ages, manuscript culture expanded. Scribes copied romances by hand, often modifying them in the process. Illustrations depicted knights in contemporary armour. Castles resembled local architecture. The past was repeatedly updated to resemble the present. This is why medieval manuscripts show Arthur's knights dressed like 13th century nobles rather than early medieval warriors. Accuracy was not the goal, recognition was. As Europe entered the late Middle Ages, political instability, famine, and plague reshaped society. Interest in chivalric romance waned in some regions, while spiritual and moral literature gained prominence. Arthurian material persisted, but often in condensed or altered forms. By the 15th century, the legend was already considered old. When the printing press spread across Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, certain versions of the Arthurian story gained dominance, simply because they were printed more widely. Editors selected what to include, what to exclude, and how to arrange material. Printing did not stabilize the legend, it narrowed it. Even so, multiple traditions survived alongside one another. In the early modern period, roughly the 16th to 18th centuries, Arthurian legend receded from cultural prominence. Classical antiquity, religious reform and emerging scientific thought reshaped literary taste. Knights and quests felt distant from contemporary concerns, but the legend did not disappear. It waited. During the 19th century, especially in Victorian Britain, Arthur returned in a new form. This revival did not aim to recover medieval truth. It aimed to address modern anxiety. Industrialization, urbanization, and empire had transformed daily life. Medieval imagery offered contrast, a vision of order, morality, and personal responsibility that felt absent in modern systems. Victorian writers reinterpreted Arthurian legend through a moral lens. Violence softened. Internal struggle replaced physical hardship. Camelot became an ethical ideal rather than a political one. Once again, the legend adapted to its era. In the 20th century, amid global wars and ideological conflict, Arthurian themes shifted again. Certainty eroded. Stories emphasized failure, ambiguity, and collapse. Fellowship became fragile. Leadership became suspect. The legend mirrored a world no longer confident in simple moral answers. Modern retelling reflect this unease. Arthurian stories now question authority rather than affirm it. They explore doubt, compromise, and unintended consequences. Camelot still appears, but rarely without warning signs already visible. Across all these periods, one pattern remains constant. The legend survives not because it is fixed, but because it is flexible. Each era reshaped Arthur to suit its fears, values, and hopes. Oral storytellers adapted to memory. Medieval poets adapted to court culture. Victorian writers adapted to moral anxiety. Modern creators adapt to uncertainty. Arthurian legend is not a historical artifact, it is a cultural instrument, and that is why it continues to function. When audiences encounter the Round Table today, they are not meeting the Middle Ages. They are meeting a layered construction, built over centuries, revised repeatedly and never finalised. The legend endures because it never insists on a single version of itself. It allows each era to see what it needs to see, and as long as societies continue to wrestle with power, leadership and moral responsibility, the story will find new ways to be told, anchored not in the past, but in the present moment, asking it to speak. In the early medieval centuries, roughly from the 6th through the 9th century, people did not experience the past as a fixed record of events. History was something inherited through memory, custom, and repeated story rather than preserved through documents. In this environment, the question of whether Arthur had existed as a single identifiable individual rarely arose in a way that resembles modern skepticism. What mattered instead was whether a story helped explain the present. In a landscape shaped by invasion, political collapse, and shifting identities, figures associated with resistance and order carried meaning regardless of their precise origins. Arthur fit naturally into this mental world, not as a distant hero to be verified, but as a remembered presence whose authority came from repetition rather than proof. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages of the 11th and 12th centuries, attitudes toward history began to change. Literacy expanded among clerics and noble elites, and written chronicles multiplied. With writing came comparison, and with comparison came awareness of contradiction. Different accounts of the past could now be placed side by side, revealing inconsistencies that oral tradition had previously absorbed without concern. Even so, belief in Arthur did not collapse under scrutiny. Medieval chroniclers often acknowledged uncertainty without feeling compelled to resolve it. A figure could be partly historical and partly legendary without creating intellectual discomfort. Arthur was frequently treated as a ruler whose deeds had been embellished over time, rather than as a complete invention. The lack of precise dates or corroborating records did not invalidate the story because historical certainty was not yet the primary goal. By the late Middle Ages, during the 14th and 15th centuries, a more cautious tone emerged among educated writers. Chroniclers became increasingly aware of how stories evolved, and some began to question whether Arthur had ruled in the manner described by Romance literature. Others suggested that his reputation had grown far beyond its original scope, shaped by centuries of retelling rather than by direct memory. Despite this growing skepticism, Arthur remained embedded in cultural identity. He appeared in genealogies, local traditions, and regional histories that treated him as a figure of the past even while acknowledging uncertainty. Doubt and belief existed simultaneously, not as opposing positions, but as overlapping ways of understanding inherited stories. The early modern period, spanning roughly the 16th through the 18th centuries, introduced a more decisive shift. Scholars increasingly emphasized evidence, documentation, and physical remains as the foundation of historical inquiry. Antiquarians examined ruins, inscriptions, and manuscripts with the aim of separating credible history from literary invention. Under these standards, Arthur's position became increasingly difficult to defend. References were late, sources disagreed, archaeological evidence failed to align with literary descriptions. Some scholars attempted to reconcile these problems by proposing that Arthur represented a composite figure or a symbolic memory of multiple leaders. Others concluded that the legend could not be sustained as historical fact. This did not eliminate the story, but it altered its classification. Arthur gradually moved from the realm of history into that of literature and folklore. He was no longer treated as a ruler whose existence could be established through evidence. but as a narrative whose significance lay elsewhere. During the 18th century, Enlightenment thinking further reinforced this division. Rational inquiry encouraged skepticism toward inherited myths, and Arthurian legend was often viewed as a product of medieval imagination rather than a reflection of historical reality. Yet even in this climate, the story retained emotional and cultural resonance. Local traditions continued, and the absence of proof did not erase attachment to the legend. The 19th century, particularly in Victorian Britain, reshaped the question once again. Victorians were deeply invested in history, but they valued moral meaning as much as factual certainty. For many writers and thinkers of this period, Arthur's importance did not depend on whether he could be proven to have existed. What mattered was what he represented. Arthur became a symbol of moral leadership, restraint and responsibility at a time when industrialization and empire raised uncomfortable questions about power. The legend was treated less as a historical claim and more as a cultural inheritance. Doubt about literal truth no longer threatened the story because belief had shifted towards symbolism rather than fact. By the 20th century, modern historical standards largely settled the academic debate. Most historians agreed that there was insufficient evidence to confirm Arthur as a single historical individual. At best, he might reflect a blending of multiple figures, or a mythologized memory of resistance during a turbulent period. At worst, he was entirely fictional, yet public interest did not fade with this conclusion. Instead, the focus changed. Modern audiences became less concerned with whether Arthur had lived, and more interested in why the question had mattered for so long. The endurance of belief itself became the subject. This shift reflects a broader change in how modern societies engage with the past. Historical accuracy remains important, but meaning is no longer assumed to depend on factual certainty alone. Arthurian legend continues to function because it offers a way to explore leadership, responsibility, and failure without requiring belief in literal truth. Across every era, the status of Arthur adapted to prevailing assumptions about history. Early medieval audiences accepted him as part of a remembered past. High medieval writers balanced belief with ambiguity. Early modern scholars subjected him to evidence-based scrutiny. Victorians reimagined him as a moral ideal. Modern audiences treat him as a lens rather than a claim. What remains consistent is not belief, but relevance. Arthur endures not because he can be proven, but because each era finds a reason to keep him. The legend survives intellectual revolutions precisely because it does not depend on certainty. It accommodates doubt without collapsing under it. In this way, Arthur occupies a rare position in cultural memory. He is neither firmly historical nor easily dismissed. He exists in the space where stories outlast facts, not by resisting scrutiny, but by adapting to it. And that adaptability, rather than belief or disbelief, may be the most enduring legacy of all. Medieval legends did not exist only in words, they settled into the land itself. Long before maps were standardized or borders fixed, people understood their world through place names, landmarks and familiar routes. Hills, rivers, ruins and forests were not neutral features of the landscape. They carried memory. A story attached to a place could give it meaning, authority and age. Arthurian legend absorbed this instinct early. As the stories spread across Britain and beyond, they began to anchor themselves to specific locations. A hill became a battlefield. A ruined fort became a royal seat. A spring or cave became a site of prophecy or disappearance. These associations were rarely consistent across regions, but they served an important purpose. They allowed listeners to locate legend within their own environment. Camelot did not need to be found, it needed to feel findable. In the medieval imagination, a story felt more real when it could be walked toward. A traveller passing an ancient earthwork or crumbling stone structure did not see a mystery to be solved, but a past waiting to be explained. Legend provided that explanation. This process worked in both directions. Stories attached themselves to places, and places absorbed prestige from stories. A village connected to Arthur gained symbolic importance. A monastery near a legendary site inherited authority. Geography and narrative reinforced one another. This habit was not unique to Arthurian legend, but the scale was. Across medieval Britain, dozens of locations became associated with Arthur or his knights. Some claims were local and modest, others were promoted deliberately by elites seeking legitimacy. None could be conclusively proven, but proof was never the point. What mattered was continuity. A place that could claim Arthur could claim antiquity, and antiquity carried weight in a society that valued lineage and inherited authority. To say that Arthur had passed through a region was to say that the land itself participated in the story of Britain. This is why many Arthurian sites cluster around ruins from earlier periods. Roman forts, Iron Age hill forts, and abandoned settlements provided visible evidence of a forgotten past. Their presence invited explanation. Arthur became one of the most convenient answers available. The ruins did not need to match the stories exactly. Their age alone suggested significance. Medieval observers were not concerned with precise dating. A structure that looked ancient was ancient enough. Over time, the landscape itself became a narrative archive. Rivers were said to have carried swords. Stones bore marks of supernatural events. Paths were traced as the routes of legendary journeys. Even natural features were folded into the story, as if the land had witnessed the events and retained memory of them. This approach to legend reflects how medieval people understood time. The past was not distant. It was layered beneath the present, visible in fragments and traces. A legend did not belong to a specific century so much as to a continuing story of place. Arthurian legend fit this worldview particularly well because it was already unstable and flexible. It could adapt to local geography without losing coherence. Arthur could be said to have fought here, rested there, vanished elsewhere, all without contradiction. In this way, the legend spread not only through manuscripts and voices, but through walking. Travellers carried stories between regions. Pilgrims encountered local variations. Each retelling adjusted details to fit the surrounding landscape. Over generations, these variations hardened into tradition. By the late Middle Ages, some locations were so firmly associated with Arthurian legends that questioning the connection would have seemed unnecessary, even rude. The story belonged to the place, and the place belonged to the story. This attachment between legend and land also explains why Arthur never truly disappears. Even when written versions fell out of favour, the geography remained. Place names endured, local stories persisted. A ruined hill did not stop being ancient simply because a book went unread. When later generations returned to Arthurian legend, they often did so through these physical anchors. Antiquarians, poets and historians walked the same landscapes medieval storytellers had used. The land offered continuity when texts did not. This process continued into the modern era. Tourism, archaeology and heritage culture inherited the medieval habit of story-based geography. Sites associated with Arthur are still visited, debated and reimagined. the question of accuracy remains secondary to the experience of connection. Standing in a place tied to legend feels different than reading about it. The land does some of the work. This helps explain why attempts to solve Arthur by identifying a single definitive Camelot often fail to satisfy. The legend was never meant to resolve into one location. Its power lies in multiplicity. Camelot exists wherever the story needs it to exist. In medieval terms, this made perfect sense. Authority was local, identity was regional. A legend that could belong to many places at once was stronger than one that belonged to only one. Arthur became not just a figure of history or myth, but a way of organising space. This spatial dimension also reinforced the legend's emotional weight. Stories tied to real places feel less abstract. They invite participation rather than belief. One does not need to accept every detail to feel the pull of proximity. You can stand where it might have happened. That possibility is enough. Even today, modern retellings often return to this instinct. Films, novels, and games emphasize settings as much as characters. Forests, castles, and ruins carry mood and meaning independent of plot. This is not accidental. It echoes the medieval understanding that story and landscape are inseparable. Arthurian legend endures because it inhabits the world rather than floating above it. It settles into hills and valleys. It lingers in ruined walls. It follows roads that still exist. And as long as the land continues to invite explanation, stories will continue to answer. The medieval landscape did not merely host the legend, it learned it. And once learned, it never fully forgot. In medieval storytelling, ideas rarely travelled alone. They were carried by objects. Swords, crowns, rings, relics, and books did more than decorate stories. They anchored meaning in a world where abstract authority was difficult to sustain. When political systems shifted and loyalties fractured, material things offered continuity. An object could endure even when people did not. Arthurian legend reflects this instinct clearly. Power in these stories is rarely inherited solely through blood or proclamation. It is proven through possession, recognition, and correct use of symbolic objects. The most famous example is the sword associated with Arthur, but the pattern extends far beyond a single weapon. In a medieval context, objects mattered because they were tangible. Land might change hands, titles might be disputed, but a physical item could be seen, held and displayed, could be shown to others as evidence of legitimacy. This mattered in a society where written documentation was limited and authority was often contested. Objects provided proof when words could not. In the early medieval world, swords in particular carried enormous symbolic weight. They were expensive, difficult to make, and closely associated with status. A sword was not merely a tool of war, it represented the right to wield force. In Arthurian legend, the sword does not simply grant power, it identifies who is entitled to hold it. The act of recognition matters more than the act of violence. The sword becomes a test rather than a weapon. This distinction reflects medieval anxieties about leadership. Anyone could claim authority, fewer could justify it. Objects offered a way to externalize judgment. The sword chooses rather than the crowd. Responsibility shifts from people to symbol. The same logic applies to other legendary objects. Crowns appear not only as markers of rule but as burdens. They weigh visibly on those who wear them. Rings signify loyalty and binding agreements in a world where written contracts were rare or inaccessible. Shields display identity publicly, allowing recognition at a distance in chaotic environments. These objects do not exist in isolation. They circulate. A sword is given, lost, recovered or passed on. A ring changes hands. A crown is stolen or set aside. Movement matters because it mirrors instability. Objects travel when systems fail. This pattern is not unique to Arthurian legend, but Arthurian stories emphasize it with unusual consistency. When human relationships fracture, objects continue to operate as carriers of meaning. Relics function similarly. In medieval Christianity, relics bridged the gap between the earthly and the divine. They offered physical contact with spiritual authority. Their power did not depend on understanding, only on presence. Arthurian legend borrows this logic without fully adopting religious structure. Certain objects acquire significance not because of craftsmanship, but because of association. They have been touched by the right hands, witnessed the right moments, or participated in decisive events. Their history matters more than their material. This emphasis reveals a deeper medieval assumption: meaning accumulates. An object gathers significance through use, memory, and narrative. It becomes heavier with time, not physically, but symbolically. To possess such an object is to inherit its past. This helps explain why medieval legends often linger on descriptions of items that modern audiences might dismiss as ornamental. These details were not decoration, they were narrative anchors. Objects stabilize stories that might otherwise drift. They also allowed legends to persist across generations. A story tied to a person risks disappearing when that person is forgotten. A story tied to an object can survive relocation. It can be shown, referenced, and reinterpreted even when original context fades. This logic extended beyond legend to real medieval life. Families preserved heirlooms not merely for value but for memory. Churches guarded relics. Towns displayed ancient artifacts to assert age and legitimacy. Objects carried identity forward when lineage alone was insufficient. Arthurian legend reflects and amplifies this behaviour. The Round Table itself functions as an object in this sense. It is not merely furniture, it is a physical manifestation of an idea. Its shape encodes equality, its presence makes abstraction visible. When the fellowship fails, the table remains as evidence that unity once existed. This persistence gives objects narrative power. They outlast intentions, they outlast promises, they even outlast belief. By the late Middle Ages, when confidence in chivalric ideals began to erode, the objects remained easier to hold on to than the ideals themselves. Stories could be doubted, symbols could still be displayed. In later retellings, objects often take on greater prominence as certainty fades. When people are less confident in leadership, they look for external markers of legitimacy. Material culture fills the gap left by trust. This pattern continues into the modern era. Contemporary retellings of medieval legends often focus heavily on iconic items. The sword becomes central. The crown dominates imagery, the relic drives the plot. These objects provide narrative clarity in stories that might otherwise feel abstract. They offer continuity in fragmented worlds. Even when modern audiences no longer believe in divine selection or inherited authority, the symbolism remains legible. Objects still feel meaningful because they embody effort, sacrifice, and history. They suggest that power should be earned, not merely claimed. This may be the most enduring function of legendary objects. They externalize judgment. Instead of asking whether a person deserves authority, the story asks whether they can bear the weight of what they carry. The object becomes a test of character rather than a guarantee of success. In Arthurian legend, objects rarely solve problems permanently. They reveal truth, provoke conflict, or expose weakness. Possession alone is never enough. This restraint reflects medieval caution. Objects can grant legitimacy, but they cannot prevent failure. They do not protect against pride, jealousy, or betrayal. They only mark moments when ideals briefly align with action. When those ideals collapse, the objects remain behind as witnesses, and that may be their final role. In a world where stories shift and systems fail, objects remember. They do not explain, they do not forgive, they simply endure. Arthurian legend understands this deeply. It places meaning in things because people are unreliable. It allows symbols to outlast certainty. It trusts material memory more than human promise. That trust has proven justified. Long after belief fades and doubt takes its place, the objects remain, not as proof that the story was true, but as reminders that people once needed it to be. By mid-morning, the Middle Ages were fully awake. The hush of dawn had lifted, replaced by the low hum of life itself. Smoke curled from chimney pots in long ribbons that drifted lazily above the thatched rooftops. Dogs barked from distant courtyards, and the air trembled faintly with the sound of bells from neighbouring parishes, answering one another across the hills. The world had slipped quietly from prayer into purpose. In every medieval village, labour began with the same certainty as sunrise. The wheelwright tested his spokes with a careful tap of his hammer, listening for flaws in the wood. The blacksmith's forge hissed like a living thing, sparks skipping across the packed earth floor. Women drew water from wells, their laughter carrying over the clatter of buckets. Children chased one another between drying lines and hens, weaving games through the rhythm of chores. Work and play were never far apart. Both were ways of being alive. Fields stretched outward, in patient order. Farmers bent their backs to the plough, boots sinking into damp soil that smelled of iron and spring. Oxen snorted in the traces. Ravens followed close behind, picking at the newly turned ground. The sun was high enough to warm the shoulders, but kind enough not to scorch. In the medieval world, time was measured by shadow and sweat. The steady creak of wooden yokes, the rhythmic strike of hoes, the rustle of grain, all became part of the land's heartbeat. The marketplace bloomed like a garden of noise. Vendors called their wares in half a dozen tongues: English, French, Latin, and dialects born somewhere in between. Fishmongers laid rows of silver-scaled catch over crushed herbs to hide the smell. Cloth merchants unfurled bolts of wool dyed in indigo, crimson, and the pale green of meadow grass. The air shimmered with spice, pepper, nutmeg, saffron for the wealthy, and the faint sweetness of honey for the rest. Coins rang on wooden tables, dogs begged, and arguments were settled with a shrug and a handshake. The Middle Ages were rough, but they were rarely dull. Inside the monastery, the rhythm was slower, more deliberate. The monks of the Middle Ages moved through corridors lined with script and silence. Their ink-stained fingers worked steadily across parchment, copying texts so ancient that no one remembered the hands that first wrote them. Between prayers they tended herb gardens, sage for digestion, lavender for calm, mint to flavour the poor man's wine. They listened to the bees, learning patience from the hum. To the monks, the garden and the book were the same lesson. All things required tending. In castle kitchens, heat shimmered like water. Servants hurried between hearths, their faces bright with effort and sweat. Copper pots gleamed, ladles clanged, and somewhere a hound barked impatiently, hoping for scraps. The air smelled of roasted fowl, onions, and rosemary. Cooks argued cheerfully while scullions scoured plates in basins of cloudy water. Every movement had a place, every task a rhythm. The castle's grandeur depended on 1,000 unseen hands. Beyond the walls, the world moved at the pace of feet and hooves. Pilgrims trudged the long roads toward holy shrines, rosaries clicking softly in their fingers. Merchants guided their wagons from town to town, wheels carving grooves in the mud that would outlast them. At the crossroads stood stone shrines, rough-hewn statues wrapped in ribbons, or crowned with flowers left by travellers. Some left coins for safe passage, others left prayers folded in leaves. The medieval times were an age of faith on the move, weary, dusty, but devoted. By afternoon, sunlight turned golden and thick. It spilled across fields of barley and wheat, glinting on the edges of scythes. Farmers sang to keep their strokes in rhythm, voices low and even, carried away by wind. Children gathered wildflowers near the hedgerows, weaving them into crowns for no one in particular. The smell of cut grass, smoke and sweat hung in the air, the perfume of an honest day. Somewhere a stream murmured over stones, a sound older than any prayer. In the towns, artisans carved saints and beasts from oak and limewood. Potters spun wheels that hummed softly beneath their palms. Tailors stitched coloured thread through fine linen, gossiping about the weather and the price of sheep. The Middle Ages were not without art. Beauty was simply folded into duty. A doorframe carved with vines, a spoon polished until it caught the sun, small testaments to the human need to make even necessity graceful. As the afternoon deepened, the air grew warm and still. Shadows lengthened across the lanes, stretching toward the churchyard walls. The Angelus bell sounded, a brief pause in the long breath of labour. Tools were set down, caps were doffed, and a shared silence passed between workers who knew the words by heart. A prayer for gratitude, a prayer for endurance. Then the rhythm resumed, steady as before, quieter now, touched with weariness and peace. Inside the taverns, the first mugs were filled. Ale foamed over wooden rims, hands slapped shoulders in greeting. Minstrels tuned their lutes by the fire while travellers traded stories of distant abbeys, strange storms at sea, rumours of kings and wars none had seen. The laughter was low, the music soft, even joy in the medieval world kept a respectful volume. In the narrow lanes outside, candles glowed in the windows of cottages. Children carried rushlights to the loft. Mothers folded cloth. Fathers leaned on doorframes watching the last light drain from the sky. The air cooled, smelling faintly of hearth smoke and baked earth. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled, and a farmer's dog answered from behind his fence. The Middle Ages settled back into their familiar balance, half toil, half prayer, held together by faith and fatigue. As twilight came, the bells rang once more, softer now, their echoes weaving through the darkening streets. The smoke that rose at dawn now drifted homeward, blurring with the evening haze. Doors closed, shutters latched, and fires brightened against the coming dark. The day's rhythm slowed, but it never stopped. It merely shifted to the quieter pulse of rest. Tomorrow the same sequence would unfold again, the turning of wheels, the tolling of bells, the patient labour of survival. And so the medieval times carried on, not in glory but in persistence. Each sunrise began a prayer, each sunset sealed it, and somewhere between the two humanity found its peace, in work, in song, in the steady grace of repetition. When the story of Arthur finally slows, it does not end with triumph or defeat. It fades. There is no single moment when the world decisively turns away from Camelot. Instead, attention drifts, voices soften. The urgency that once carried the legend forward gradually loosens its grip. What remains is not a lesson clearly stated, but an impression that lingers longer than expected. This quiet ending is deliberate. Medieval legends rarely close their doors firmly. They recede rather than conclude, allowing listeners to step away without feeling pushed. Arthur does not die in a way that feels final. He departs. Camelot does not vanish in fire or ruin alone. It dissolves into memory. This manner of ending reflects how medieval people understood loss. Not as an event, but as a process. Worlds changed slowly, often without anyone realizing exactly when the old order had passed. Customs faded, places emptied, stories lost urgency. What remained was familiarity without clarity, a sense that something meaningful had once been present, even if it could no longer be named precisely. Arthurian legend mirrors this experience. It does not ask to be remembered in detail, it asks to be felt. As the centuries move forward, the legend continues to drift through culture in fragments rather than as a whole. A name appears, a symbol resurfaces, a familiar pattern emerges inside a new story. The audience recognizes it without needing explanation. This recognition is quiet, almost instinctive. The Round Table becomes shorthand for fairness attempted rather than achieved. The sword becomes a sign of responsibility rather than conquest. The disappearing king becomes a symbol of leadership that cannot survive unchanged. None of these meanings require belief. They operate beneath it. This is why the legend proves unusually resistant to exhaustion. Stories that insist on clarity eventually harden. Stories that accept ambiguity remain flexible. Arthurian legend survives because it never demands agreement, only attention. It allows people to bring their own uncertainties with them. In this sense, the legend does not belong fully to the Middle Ages, nor to any later period that reinterpreted it. It exists between eras, adapting without erasing its earlier shapes. Each generation adds a layer, not by replacing what came before, but by settling gently on top of it. The result is not coherence in the modern sense. It is continuity. That continuity is emotional rather than factual. People return to the story not to learn what happened, but to sit with what it suggests. That power, authority and unity are fragile, that ideals matter even when they fail, that systems built by humans inevitably reflect human weakness. These are not medieval observations, they are persistent ones. The legend remains useful because it never pretends otherwise. It does not offer a blueprint for perfect leadership. It offers a meditation on its limits. It does not celebrate victory without cost. It acknowledges that even well-intentioned structures can collapse under pressure. In doing so, it avoids the trap of certainty. Camelot falls not because it was evil, but because it was human. That distinction matters. It allows admiration without denial. It invites reflection rather than obedience. As the story settles, the figures within it become quieter. Arthur becomes less a ruler than a memory of leadership shaped by hope. The knights become less heroic individuals than representations of effort, loyalty, and failure. The objects lose their urgency and gain weight as symbols rather than tools. The landscape remains. Hills still rise, ruins still stand, roads still lead past places once claimed by story. The land does not insist that anything happened there. It simply holds space for the possibility that something mattered. This patience is part of the legend's final tone. It does not chase relevance, it waits. Modern audiences often encounter Arthurian legend indirectly, filtered through later storytelling traditions. Even so, the emotional shape remains recognizable. There is always a sense of something attempted with sincerity, undone without malice, and remembered without certainty. That combination is rare. Many stories promise resolution. Few accept erosion. Arthurian legend allows ideals to wear down gradually rather than shatter dramatically. It treats loss as something absorbed rather than resisted. This makes the story unusually compatible with reflection and with rest. It does not demand attention through spectacle alone. It invites it through atmosphere, repetition, and gentle familiarity. One can enter the story at almost any point and still recognize its contours. That openness explains why the legend adapts so easily to quiet retellings. It does not rely on surprise. It relies on mood. As the epilogue settles, what remains is not a moral delivered clearly, but a question left open. How long can unity last? How much responsibility can power carry? Whether ideals are worth pursuing even when they fail? The legend does not answer these questions. It leaves them in place. That restraint may be its most enduring feature. Arthur does not return to fix what was broken. Camelot is not rebuilt perfectly. The story does not promise that what was lost can be restored without change. Instead, it offers something smaller and steadier. The assurance that attempting something just, even briefly, leaves a trace. That trace may not survive intact. It may be altered, misremembered, or repurposed. But it persists in some form, shaping expectations and language long after the original context has vanished. This is how the legend finally comes to rest. Not as history proven or disproven, not as fantasy escaped or dismissed, but as a quiet companion to thought, a story that does not insist on belief, only consideration. And when the telling grows quiet, that may be enough.